Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to try to give you some insight into how men think. Now, I can't say that I speak for all men because I don't want to put that out there, but it's interesting how obviously this is something we do. We communicate with each other and we try to get our point across, and somehow we tend to still misunderstand things. And it's part of our filter where we hear something and we think it means something else. And men and women obviously speak the same words, but they mean different things. And at times I go into the background as to how we could say the same thing but mean something totally different. But I'm going to delve into this a little bit just for the standpoint of trying to clear up misunderstandings that I know that people have. And I try to talk about vulnerability for one thing, because that oftentimes will drive an individual's impression of something. If you're not vulnerable, then a lot of times you don't necessarily feel threatened by something that someone would say. But when you're vulnerable and then something a sentence or two comes from someone that may have some tension to it, then you wind up being afraid. And having fear and vulnerability, those two things tend to go together. So if, for example, you're talking to your significant other and they're bringing some concerns that they have. Well, when you're vulnerable, obviously it's going to get your attention, and you may fear that if this is one conversation, which maybe be a long line of conversations about the same subject, you can fear that the relationship is at risk of being lost or something like that. That's going to have a lot of anxiety. It's going to make you react probably very defensive to hear that. It's just a natural reaction to something when you feel as though it's threatened and you're going to lose something very valuable to you. So I say that just to frame it up so that if you're the person that is bringing this conversation to someone else and you are getting a reaction that seems to be a little over the top, rationalize this. There's fear involved, and getting around that part of the breakdown, so that which is what I call part of the mechanics of communicating. It's not just the words at this point, but it's how it's being interpreted, how the reaction is coming back, and it's like this thing is just bouncing all over the room, and we're really not getting the problem solved. So what tends to happen? The conversation breaks down, we don't get any further, and that sort of adds more intensity to it. So I'm going to give you some insight on, so that was an example of something that breaks down. And I'm going to give you some insight on how to separate this thing out so we can get some clarity so that we can have a better understanding. And men and women can apply this equally. That's not gender specific. But I did give you an idea about vulnerability, how you have the breakdown of communication, and then this whole thing seems to just start a fire burning, and we can't seem to get it contained. So I'm going to take a really short break, and then I'm going to come back. Stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson. And when I left off with the just before the break, I was talking about vulnerability. And we all have our own experience with that. As a guy, the vulnerability that I would have myself, and I'll be personal about it, one of the vulnerabilities I have is when I'm revealing what I'm feeling, that who's ever listening might not accept that. That is, my girlfriend might not accept it. And when that happens, then I get into the scramble as to how to justify what I'm feeling. And it's a big fear that it won't be accepted. Well, when you're in a relationship and being accepted is one of those reasons why you're in that relationship, and then when something about you is not being accepted, then it feels like, you're being shut down, like you're not welcome, like you're not loved, and that you're having to climb that mountain to get to the top to feel validated. So, and I'm saying this to men as well as to women, it feels like that on both sides. So if your significant other is trying to explain something to you and you're kind of giving them the, shaking your head, no, that's not acceptable, I'm not liking that. Well, to start out with is we're in a vulnerable place and we're expressing feelings. Feelings in and of them are exactly what they are. And this is the problem with relationships when we're having a breakdown of communication, is the listener is hearing feelings as though they're facts. And sometimes, or quite often, the person who is speaking the feelings are speaking them as though they are facts. And you have to get to the understanding when we're communicating the nuances of this. And by understanding that just because we say it doesn't mean that it's true, especially from the listener. When you're hearing somebody, say maybe your significant other is expressing a concern that they have, learning to listen to what your significant other is saying in terms of the words and the feelings is very important to helping to de-escalate and helping to get beyond the stalemate, the roadblock that often happens. Because as the listener, you're there to listen and understand. And one of the things that I feel it becomes very helpful in this is you begin to write down what you're hearing. And then we do this thing called mirroring. Mirroring means you're going to read it back to them exactly the way they said it, and then you try to work out the details of what it means. And by doing this, it's not about you who's doing the writing down. You're listening to your significant other express their feelings. It's not about trying to change their opinion about what things mean. Not at this point. It's about writing down and getting them to recognize that you are trying to be cause in the matter to resolve the problem. Because that's an important thing in having insight and building trust in a relationship, that you're allowing your significant other to speak their piece. Now, we do this for a short period of time because this is a building block process. Because then what we need to do on the other side of this is the person who's doing the writing, who's taking the dictation, you are going to then read back what you hear and hope that you got it right. If you got it right, okay, then we can move to the next step. If you didn't get it right, then you got to start over again and be sure to get the clarification, and then we move forward. Okay, so the next step to this is, as you're reading back what they've said to you, and if it's in the form of a question, maybe they're asking you a question, now you're going to have to answer their question for them, and you want to be very specific. Specific in the standpoint that we don't want a lot of convoluted answers and explanations of things, because oftentimes that may come across as that you're trying to hide something. And that's what we're not trying to do, because that's not going to smooth this out. That's going to add more to the confusion. And sometimes we use words and things that may block the communication, because it seems if we're talking above someone's head, it's as if we're trying to show superiority. And I mean this on both parts, whether you're the man or the woman here. And when that happens, it appears as if you're trying to dominate someone rather than talk to them. You know, we obviously come together and we have different varying degrees of education, backgrounds. So I'm suggesting that you be yourself in your communication, but I'm also suggesting that I think each of us is bright enough to know when we're talking down to someone and to avoid that at all costs, because the appearance of which, when you do something like that, It just adds one more layer to the complexity of trying to sort this out. Now, counselors do this all the time, in which we try to get to the heart of the matter by allowing each person to express themselves, and then the person who's listening has to mirror it back. We deal with that issue and resolve it, and then we pledge to move on. And that's another important thing about this process. It is in learning to listen, we're resolving it, and then we're moving on. And we need to remember what we've said, and that's why it's really important to have something to write down on. Or in this day and age, you have smartphones and we have tablets and things. We can type it in, or we can say it, speak it. It has software in there, and it can put all your dialogue into words. But we create a record of it. And as we make progress along this, the idea is that we're problem solving and we're trust building. That's the point to this. That's what lifts a relationship up, is problem solving together and trust building. It's important to also recognize that people have strengths in relationships. And I think bringing these strengths to the relationship, and oftentimes that's why opposites attract, is one person is good at one particular thing and you might admire that, so you're attracted to that person. And those things are beautiful when they work. One of the things that happens in relationships, and I've seen this happen many times, is the thing that attracts you is also the thing that makes you fearful. For example, and I'm going to use this illustration. If you're a man and you see a very attractive woman, you approach her, you have a relationship going, you move this down the way, you have a relationship going. And that woman that you approached, one of the things that she was not only attractive, I'm not just talking physically, but she was very gregarious. And gregarious means is a person who's very outgoing and has a capacity, that very charismatic. Well, that at some point oftentimes can become the one thing that then makes you very fearful, because that gregarious girl that you were attracted to then is also attractive to other people. And that insecurity that you, the guy, may have because your girlfriend or wife or significant other is attractive to other people, it may make you behave jealously. And you start taking it out on your significant other. Well, they are being themselves. And you have to recognize that which may be attractive to you can also make you very afraid. We call it come here, go away. And it's an effect that happens in lots of things. But that's a very simple illustration of what happens. And women, it's the same thing. Whereas you may be attracted to a guy, he's very smart, he's intelligent, other people seem to be very drawn to this person. And when you're in the presence of this individual, it's very attractive when you have their undivided attention. But when they are the life of the party, they're center of attention from everyone else, and you feel ignored, well, now you may have some feeling of rejection that you're not as important. Well, that relationship that you have with that person does not change. That relationship is still there. But in that moment, they're in a different environment. And I'm not at all suggesting that you are being forgotten. But what I'm suggesting is when the person is in that other element, and let's say being the life of the party, they are being themselves. And that was also the person that was attractive to you as well. And don't forget that you're attracted to that, and you're operating at that moment where you may be fearful of that charisma, and because everybody else is attracted to it. I don't think it gives anyone license to then be flirtatious and then to try to do things outside to disrupt the relationship. But what I'm saying in respect to the examples that I've given you, that when people are being themselves, they still love you, but they're also being themselves in those other elements. And those are some really real-time examples of how you can be attracted to something, but then it also becomes something that can make you very fearful. And I encourage people to talk about those kind of things in a situation when it's not highly charged. So if you're at that social gathering, so to speak, and your significant other is seeming to get a lot of attention, if you raise too much of it at that moment, it could be misunderstood. It could be misinterpreted. If you take a different moment and talk about it in a calm, rational way, I think then the communication can be had, and it's a better opportunity to be understanding. And then what may come from that is you could say is next time we get in a situation and it seems like this thing is is not having some containment, you might have some code words to say, and to communicate, and then we can change that that dynamic. Maybe it might mean you say, I'm feeling a little uncomfortable, and you know what they say, hey, honey, I'm sorry. I'll just throw them a wink, across the room, let you know, hey, I know you're still here. I haven't forgot about you. I'm just here operating this here. But you know what? That's that personal communication thing that when two people have a relationship, they can be on opposite sides of the room, give a glance, and they're back in sync here. So that's something that I encourage people to do, and I use that myself. And it also helps keep me grounded. But it's really nice to know that no matter what's going on, you're still connected to your partner, because remember, they're your partner. They got your back. And I'll be right back after this.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back. I'm John Johnson, your host for the Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. And I'm talking about insight, and I'm giving you a few examples of things that happen, breakdowns of communication and relationship, and how we can kind of repair those things. One of the things I talked about was when you're sitting down and having a conversation with your significant other about the mirroring technique, which is pretty common. It's old stuff that they use in therapy, but it's about listening to your partner, writing down some of the things or their concerns, and then mirroring them back, reading them back as they have said them, repeating it to them, and then getting the validation that, yeah, that's what I said. And then you talk about the subject and give answers. And you try to keep it sweet, keep it tight, and then you move on, and you basically trade back and forth on that. And the important thing is your trust building, and you're dealing with the vulnerability that happens in a relationship when your significant other is sharing with you something that goes on. And I gave another example of something that happens in relationships where when you're attracted to someone, and this has to do with the vulnerability part, when you go into a social setting, and the very thing that attracts you to an individual could also be the very thing that makes you afraid of them or makes you fearful, worried about the relationship. So if they're very charismatic and they seem to be the life of the party, when they get into those social situations where they are on, to use the term, then you feel like you're forgotten. And I was suggesting that you develop a little code word or maybe a wink or something like that, one to share that you have some vulnerability, and the other to validate from your significant other that you're still connected, that you're still together. And that's some of the beauty of having a relationship when you've had it a while and you have those certain looks, those glances that you can look across the room. And this is all positive. This isn't anything to be scared of. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do that to your significant other, is to throw them a wink and let them know, yeah, we're still together. Something else that I'm going to cover, and I'll just talk about it for a bit here. It's the sex between men and women and what's important. I'm going to just give a little bit of insight on it. From a man's standpoint, one of the things that's important to a man, and I'm not just talking about the physical sexuality, but it's respect. Men want respect from their partner. And by having that respect, then they feel they're being vulnerable. That's the payoff. They're vulnerable. They get the respect from their significant other, and that it fills you up from the inside. And then as a person, as a man, you feel so much more of a capacity to want to give. And respect comes in many forms. And I think this is one of those things where you ask your partner how they most feel respected. In one of my earlier podcasts, I talked about the languages of love and how there's touch, there's gift giving, there's acts of kindness, there's words. And when my way of giving love is acts of service. So, one of the things that I like to do is when I do things for people I love, and not just my significant other, but it could be, my kids, it could be, a friendly thing for my neighbor. That's one of my ways of giving. But but bringing it back to the significant other, it's if you ask a woman, you ask your significant other to do something for you very specific, and they do that with a sense of pride and being appreciated after the act of service. Say, for example, if it's an oil change. Hey, honey, will you change my oil? Change the oil. Says, hey, honey, your oil is changed. I do that for you. Because that's one of the ways in which he contributes to the relationship. Then that's also an act of love, an act of service. And being validated for that gives that that sense of respect, that sense of appreciation. And it's a wonderful feeling how when you do that, when you're the genesis of that, how it tends to build. And sometimes in relationships, when you're in a rough spot, it's hard to want to be the initiator of something like that, because then you feel like you're being more vulnerable and you want to be appreciated first. Well, I can tell you, I know how that feels, and I've been on both sides of that. One of which is sometimes I've been too stubborn to want to loosen up and give the praise because I feel like I haven't gotten it in so long. Well, the thing to do is to bring this to the conversation. I'm feeling like I'm not being appreciated, and I would like that. And at least it's a starting point. And that's something I learned a long time ago, is being able to start the dialogue. It can be very challenging because you become afraid that no matter what you say, you're going to get a lot of static about it. Well, I'm going to encourage you as partners, when you're listening to this, is to realize it sometimes it doesn't really matter how it gets started. Just start the dialogue and you work out the details. Because if you don't get anything said, then you can't begin to work towards solving the problem. And that's the worst thing of all. Because when you think about it, when you got two people who love each other and they just feel just stalemated to the point where they don't want to begin to talk, to break this thing down, so to break down the barriers, you have nowhere to go. And I learned that a long time ago from the experience of just that, being afraid to say something because I was going to be misunderstood. And yeah, misunderstandings happen. I mean, we're human beings. It's going to happen. It's going to forever happen. But take a stand. Get the dialogue started. And one of the interesting things you'll find out in a lot of relationships, it's usually one person or the other that is the fence builder. But it's important as couples that you realize that you both are trying to work for the same thing. And if you kind of have a habit in your relationship, you're the person that usually extends the olive branch. It's important for the other person to recognize, hey, take the olive branch, learn to make peace, and things work out a lot better than someone always being the protagonist or being antagonistic, because that's no fun, because that really shuts down vulnerability. But as I started to talk about sex, let me loop back around to that. And when men feel respected, feel appreciated, they're much more inclined to want to be sexual, and in a way that's really beneficial to their partner in the relationship. And the interesting irony is, when men feel sexual, they also want to show appreciation, and they can show that appreciation by being vulnerable. It's a very interesting spin. The sexual part about any relationship, there's a great deal of vulnerability, but then it extends to the part of wanting to please their partner. And now that's a wonderful thing, because now it's going a really, really good direction. To the men that are listening, women want to feel loved, and they want that before they feel sexual. That's just how part of the way in which women are wired a little differently. And I know men understand that a little differently. And for those who are listening to the podcast, recognize that sometimes you have to put your own needs to the side just a little bit, to give your partner some love, some appreciation, and then you can begin to get the physical part of it going. And it's a pretty amazing thing, because once it gets going, it's great. You show love to your partner and appreciation to your partner, and your partner does it in return. And there's a lot of good conversation that can happen after you've had a good sexual experience with your partner, because then we're in a different place. It feels like, just to say it, it feels like being vulnerable had a payoff, and it works that way for both men and women. When you recognize that you are on the same team, that you're not adversaries, that sometimes the communication breaks down, but it breaks down not because there's someone who's trying to be difficult, but sometimes they're trying so hard that it just becomes like rolling that rock up a hill. Give your partner a break. Give them some compassion, some encouragement, some love and understanding, and that begins to help melt away what's keeping this thing from going forward. So if you're not good at this, then it's something you have to practice, but you learn by doing. So give it a shot, work with your partner on it, make it something that you do together, and then you have something to fall back on, because in and of itself, you're creating a language, you're creating a dialogue. And, learning a new language is a challenge. Think of it. Learning a foreign language is a challenge. This is a foreign language for a lot of people. Music, that's an example. If you've never played an instrument before, you don't just pick up the instrument and start playing it right away. It's something that requires practice and diligence, and you pay attention to it. And as you get better at it, then you begin to enjoy the process. And relationships give you an opportunity to do this time and time and time again. And that's the beauty of it. It's built right in, so you don't even have to necessarily chase it. It's there. I implore you, take advantage of it. And by doing so, you make your life better. And you learn a great deal about yourself when you're involved with someone. We learn our shortcomings. We learn about our strengths. We learn how to give praise. We learn how we like to be praised. And, you learn to represent yourself. That's a wonderful thing to be able to do, is to represent yourself and your values and what it means to then be able to tell somebody how much you love them and represent the fact that you love them, and to be able to say it openly, honestly, freely. That's really, really wonderful things. That's going to make you stand out in life, not only for your significant other, but for your children and for the people around you. That will make you the centerpiece in the room, because it's amazing how people who are very loving are very charismatic, and that's a wonderful way to be seen. I'm John Johnson. I'm your host for Golden State Media Concepts Relationships Podcast. I want to thank you for joining me.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.